The doors of the Canadian North open on Asia and Europe. The Alaska Highway, new airfields, and mineral developments make this area a strategic center, both for the war something and the future. The war needs in the future. Okay, I can't read that. Our northern route, but it captures it nicely, right? We're opening up the north. And we allow the Americans to build the Alaska Highway, which is kind of scary to Ottawa, because if you look on a map, it looks like it's cutting Canada in half. And 30,000 Americans are in the north. They wildly overwhelm Indigenous Canadians and those very few white Canadians who are up there. And it becomes a lot less funny when the Americans, in a kind of cheeky manner, begin answering their phones as "Hello, Army of Occupation." Right? Ottawa doesn't see that as a great joke. And so we have to navigate this, and I explore this in the book, the questions of sovereignty and how much are we going to let the Americans build in the north to connect the southern states to Alaska. And it's one of many areas where we are trying to figure out how do we lean into the United States so we can help Britain, but at the same time not become a colony of the United States, right? There's a great quote from one of our diplomats who says we've just shed our colonial relationship with Britain, but what is happening now with the United States? And so that's an eternal question for us in Canada. Free trade in '88 and others, it comes back again in cycles. But this was a great challenge. And nonetheless, the North is an important battlefield for Canada and the United States, where we have to work together, especially after Hitler turns on Stalin with the invasion of Russia in June of 1941. And then, somewhat strangely, of course, the Russians, or the Soviets, become our friendly allies. And we send about $170 million worth of aid to the Soviet Union. But maybe our greatest contribution is we fly up 8,000 aircraft that are made in the United States or Canada through the Northwest Staging Route, it's called. And many of them are passing through Edmonton as a major airport to move on to Alaska. And there are Soviet pilots waiting for these aircraft, and they are then flown almost to the battlefront. And this is think about that, 8,000 aircraft flying northward. Really fascinating stories. They only lose about 200 of them, but every couple of years they find an aircraft accident site from the Second World War of American pilots or Canadian pilots. And it reminds us sometimes of the cost of even getting the weapons to the battlefield. Think of the Battle of the Atlantic, of course, how many ships were lost there. So the North becomes this really intensive air road, but so does the South. And our supply of minerals is critical in the war, something we really, again, talk about. Our hydroelectricity powers much of the northern U.S. industry. We're selling it for very cheap. We pull a nickel, several million pounds out of the earth, which are used in everything being created in the war. And aluminum. We're a great producer of aluminum, something like 3 billion pounds, of which about a third of that goes to the U.S., and it's essential for aircraft production. So there's, the cartoon on the left there is not a great cartoon, but it captures the sentiment, perhaps. And I just happened to be looking at it a couple days ago, and I see the Hitler there fulminating, saying "Schweinhound," which is one of those phrases you don't hear much, but my dad used a lot and which he may have got from his dad, who served in Bomber Command in the Second World War. So we've got the North, we've got wartime industry, we've got minerals going south, we've got the East Coast that needs to be defended. And the Royal Canadian Navy plays a critical role in both the Battle of the Atlantic and allowing those supplies to move across the Atlantic, in the convoy work that they're engaged in, our Navy that expands up to 100,000 sailors, and the fourth largest Navy in the world. And by war's end, the Royal Navy escorts about 50% of these critical convoys coming from North America. The Royal Canadian Navy escorts 48%, and the Americans escort 2%. So that's now, we need to put that into context. The United States Navy is largely fighting in the Pacific, right? The Americans are fighting a two-front war. I don't want to diminish that, but what I would say is it's important to remember this critical front as well. Moreover, when Hitler insanely declares war against the United States a few days after Pearl Harbor, the Americans are grossly ill-prepared for the naval war, the U-boat war that will come. And it does come on the East Coast. About 200 of their ships are sunk. It's a tremendous slaughter. And eventually the Royal Canadian Navy begins to peel off warships to go down the eastern seaboard to assist the Americans and to ensure that the movement of oil, for instance, from the Caribbean doesn't stop for our wartime industries as well. And it's the fight against the U-boats, and it's a long, difficult fight, one that we're frankly losing by 1942, but it's one that Canada plays a key part in. We also are involved, of course, when Japan attacks at Pearl Harbor and throughout the Pacific. And in a little quirk of fate, it is Canada that declares war on Japan before the United States does. Nonetheless, we had reason to. Of course, we had 2 battalions in Hong Kong, Sea Force as it was called, about 2,000 men, and they begin fighting a desperate battle which they will lose when they surrender on Christmas Day 1941, and then go into 4 brutal years of torture, mistreatment, and occasional murder in the prisoner of war camps. This brings the United States into the war with the Western Alliance, largely of Britain and Canada and the Dominions. But now we're also in this two-front war. And to Mackenzie King's credit, he overrules his chief of general staff and he orders a division to the West Coast. He says, we have to stand with the Americans. They need to know that we are there with them. We peel off and send additional Royal Canadian Navy corvettes to the West Coast to help patrol the 25,000 kilometers of coastline. We send 4 RCF squadrons to Alaska, which feels very threatened and isolated. We send 3 batteries of anti-aircraft guns, which we needed because they were in short supply. Again, we weaken ourselves, in this case on the East Coast, to support our American allies on the West Coast. And we did this because the Americans asked us, and we did this because we understood this is an area that we could help. We had unified our appreciation of matters of security, and this would include the gross infringement of civil liberties, the forced relocation of 23,000 Japanese Canadians and Japanese nationals from the West Coast, which followed the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were removed from many states along the coast and imprisoned. We had said we would largely follow the American lead on this, and we did, although we should not downplay both the fear in Canada, which is always neglected in our history books. You just have to read the newspapers of British Columbians. They feel that an invasion is coming. They feel they have been abandoned by Ottawa. They feel that they will die fighting on the West Coast. But there's also a tremendous amount of racism too. So history is complex. It's never easy to figure out a single narrative. Why? Because there is no single narrative. But I think this helps to explain this dark period in both Canadian and American history. We're involved in other operations like the Aleutian Campaign. This is an amazing painting from the War Museum collection by E.J. Hughes. The Aleutian Campaign was the Kiska Islands, a series of islands about 1,500 miles off the Alaska coast. The Japanese had captured them. And it was seen, at least on a map, that this could be the jumping off point for an invasion of Alaska and possibly northern British Columbia. So there is a movement to drive them out, which occurs from May of 1943, brutal fightings on one island, Attu. And then the Canadians fight with the Americans on Kiska Island in August of 43. Now, it's a strange campaign. And the Japanese had actually bugged out. They pulled out before the North Americans arrived, and yet there is a lot of credit for Canada in standing with the Americans here. There are other campaigns, and maybe I'll wrap it up over the next couple minutes and ask some questions if we feel like that. Again, the Battle of the Atlantic, going very badly for Canada and Britain in late 1942 and early 43. But even despite this desperate campaign, that has to be won. Otherwise, we can't send full war supplies to Britain. We peel off 17 of our corvettes to assist with the torch landings in North Africa, the American invasion of North Africa. That, too, is largely forgotten. Those 17 corvettes would have been really important in the Battle of the Atlantic. So again, we take a hit for the team, and I think that's worth remembering. But we're also hitting for the team, and our RCAF, which eventually will have 250,000 Canadians in it. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, where we train up 131,000 airmen. New Zealanders, Australians, Canadians, of course, the largest number, but also Americans. Americans who came north before Pearl Harbor to serve in the war. And we are fighting in the air war, largely in Northwest Europe. Again, Americans and British and Canadians involved in that. I'm going to finish up maybe with talking about briefly, three invasions and a unit. And the first invasion is Sicily in July of 1943, where the Canadians fight there. And you remember 3 American divisions on the left, 3 British divisions on the right, and the Canadians in the middle. And in a strange quirk of fate, because the British are stopped and the Americans go around the long way, we go up the gut and do some really tough fighting there. We're also involved in the second amphibious invasion of mainland Italy in September of 1943. Americans on the left, Canadians and British on the right. A unit, 1st Special Service Force, that tough-looking guy there, that unique unit of Canadians and Americans that was raised, a sort of commando unit, engaged in alpine training and difficult warfare. They will fight together, and it's a fairly unique unit. You may remember the film, The Devil's Brigade, from 1968, some of you. I was able to speak to a few veterans about that, and one of them said to me, "Tim, I remember it differently." Because in that film, the Canadians are sort of more British than the British. We're all spit and polished, marching around, and the Americans are, they haven't shaved, and they're getting into all kinds of trouble. But again, they come together Dirty Dozen style, and they take it to the enemy. Canadians and Americans served together, they commanded each other, they fought together, they died together, and I write about them in the book, and it was fascinating to explore that, because they really are a symbol, I think, of the North Americans coming together, as one of their commanders said. And the final amphibious landing to think about, the invasion on D-Day, of course, the 6th of June, 1944, 2 British divisions, 2 American divisions, with a 3rd in support, and a Canadian division, right? 3rd Canadian Division landing on Juno Beach. That means something, that Canada is there, that Canada continues, in fact, to fight after the 6th of June. We'll fight for another 11 months, 1st Canadian Army, engaging in major campaigns, as I write about in the book. Probably the most important Canadian campaign, the opening up of Antwerp, something we rarely talk about, which is part of the Scheldt campaign. But, again, we are there. And at one point, 1st Canadian Army has 450,000 soldiers in it, commanded by Harry Crear, who had done his best in 1937 and 38 to work with the Americans to start the beginning of that defense pact. Now a full general, he commands far more international soldiers in 1st Canadian Army than Canadian soldiers, including Americans. All of that and more, I think, is worth talking about. Now, if you leave today thinking that Canada won the war on its own, you'd be wrong. Right? Let's put this into perspective. The United States, Russia, Britain, China, Japan, these are the major combatants. But we're more than a footnote. We're more than a footnote. And I think if I reflect back on when I left the World War II Museum, thinking, gosh, what a great museum, but where's Canada? And thinking, we need to do a better job in telling this history, in sharing these stories. The self-inflicted wound of bashfulness or apathy needs to change. We need to re-engage with this history. And I called my book The Good Allies, initially because I wanted my American friends to know that we were good allies. As I did the research, and isn't it always fun when you do research, because no plan survives contact with research, right? You think one thing and it always changes, or it should, or you're not doing it right. And I realized Canadians needed to know that the Americans were good allies to us. That allyship went both directions. And in this war of utter necessity, Canada came to realize that free riding was out. It had to dig deep and sacrifice, and we paid our way in treasure, in weapons, and in blood. And that was the price of being a grown-up country. It's the price, I would argue, of being a consequential country, as we were during the war. And there are a lot of lessons that I talk about in the book, moving forward. NORAD and NATO and the defense of North America and the Arctic. But you know what? There's a great book for sale downstairs that you may want to explore a little bit more on. I will finish up, though, with two thoughts. Two thoughts and one observation. Those are the same thing, aren't they? Okay. Three things. One is I'll return to Mackenzie King in 1938, who said that Canada, with a great power on its border, needs to be ready to meet all joint emergencies. What he was saying there is we need to be able to stand with our American friends. They cannot feel that we are a liability. I think that is true to this day. I would also say the White House should remember that their complex network of alliances is not maintained out of charity, but instead represents a substantial multiplier of American power and a shield by which to protect the realm. That, too, is a message that is very clear from World War II and which is still true to this day. And there are other legacies, but I will end on this cross of sacrifice in Arlington Cemetery, the National Cemetery. And it was erected in 1927 to roughly 40,000 Americans who served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War. It was, there was another ceremony after the Second World War to mark the 30,000 Canadians who served in the Canadian Forces, the 30,000 Americans, who served in the Canadian Forces. And that's part of my research. And I talk about many of these Americans who came north to enlist across the border, who wanted to get into the fight. And one of them, who fought with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, so crossed likely the border at Detroit, and probably found his way to Hamilton, or some other way, I suppose, and was captured at Dieppe. And he was interviewed after the war, and he was asked, why did you join the Canadian Army? And he said, I don't regret it. I wanted to be on the right side of history. And I think he's right there. And I think this cross of sacrifice to those Americans who are on the right side of history in this war is one to remember. Also worth remembering the over 900 Americans who died with Canadian forces in this war. They are marked on many of our monuments. They are a powerful reminder of the service and sacrifice. And now is the time, I think, today, tomorrow, maybe Tuesday too, and after, of Ottawa and Washington to continue to come together, to speak loudly to that shared history, and to remember that one's good allies of the past are those of the present and of the future. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm happy to take any questions. If you have any, you can just maybe raise your hand. Any questions or comments from anyone? Yeah, sir. We'll go there and then over there. Yeah.
You started with this discussion of personalities. To what extent do you think this good allyship is institutionalized, ingrained, part of our co-cultures?
Yeah.
Or are we, as you finished by bringing us right up to today, at the whims of personalities once again?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, personalities clearly play a part, and I think we're all watching what will happen in the election and which personality emerges there. But it's also institutionalized, and we've tried to make it that in Canada because we understand the vagaries, I think, of personalities. But personalities, they help, right? You can look at some of the strong relationships. So Kennedy and Pearson, even when Pearson was not in power, great relationship. Kennedy and Diefenbaker, terrible. Think of Mulrooney, for all his faults at least, very strong relations with Reagan. But, you know, there are strong mechanisms in place. And when I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago, I didn't know we had 350 people working at our embassy. And every single day they told me this. The ambassador told me this. Every single day I am thinking about how to strengthen this relationship, and there are thousands of Canadians involved in those tasks. So I think the hard work that we saw during the war should not be simply, I suppose, seen as a fluke of history. Of course, it was driven by the necessity of the war and the understanding of what had to be done to win this war against the Nazis and the fascists. But a lot of work went into it as well. And I think afterwards a lot of work continued. And we go through cycles in this country of loving the Americans and perhaps loving them a little less. And I think our great challenge most of the time is to figure out how you elbow your way into the halls of power and how you remind the Americans, the United States, that we are an important ally. One of the ways to do that, I think, as this book reveals. Now, the book is firmly set in 39 to 45 with something on the legacy. And I'm a historian, more comfortable looking backwards and forwards. So, you know, I don't know anything that's going to happen in the election. I, like you, I get my news from the Globe and Mail or wherever else. But, you know, the work that went into this relationship was critical. And I think we have to continue to do that. And we have to find the places where we matter with the United States. And so if that was pulling off U-boats from the bow of the Atlantic where we would suffer, but to assist with the torch landings, that was seen as the right decision then. And if it was sending critical minerals to the U.S. in a very profitable relationship, that was a decision then. And of course, we have the discussions now around 2% GDP spending on defense, and can it be met? And, you know, a year and a half or 2 years ago, most Canadians not terribly interested in that. But I think now with the world on fire, we have a greater sense. It is a very dangerous place. We need to figure out how to rearm, how to protect ourselves, how to stand by our allies. And it may be sending more of Canadian soldiers to Latvia, where we have a presence. But I think that one of the lessons from this book is the North and North America, and ensuring our American allies that we are there and can defend North America. And if you think about it in those lines, maybe there's a different way to think about that 2% discussion. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Yeah.
I'm thinking that not very coherent. Like, Quebec was still hurting,
Right.
and the invasion of Paris, was that really to help improve Quebec?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, Quebec has a pretty fraught relationship with France after the 7 Years' War, and a sense that France had turned its back on New France or Quebec, and then later on turning its back on the Catholic Church. So this is an interesting discussion about the First World War I've often had with American colleagues. And they often say, why wasn't French Canada more deeply supportive of France? And so I sort of talk about how that relationship really isn't there. Although if you read a lot of French-Canadian letters, they do talk about France. So we may have that history wrong. But to come back then to 1940, the Second World War, French Canada plays a much more significant role. They send tens of thousands of people into the armed forces, wartime industry, farming is important. And so it's far less divisive, the Second World War, than the First World War. Although the conscription crisis of 44 can be, all sides are left bruised there. So it doesn't appear that in Quebec that the fall of France changes anything, although we see very little opposition to the NRMA Act, so the National Resources Mobilization Act, which brings in limited conscription in Canada. And so maybe that's one way to look at that because there wasn't a lot of opposition, maybe one way to say that this does play a key role. It's a good question. I don't think historians have quite grappled with it yet.
I just wonder what the politicians' views in the day.
Yes.
Because there's been a push and pull.
There's a push and pull. Mackenzie King wins the federal election in March of 1940. So he solidifies power, and he wins an overwhelming majority. And the way our parliamentary system is, you don't have to go back to the people again. So even if Quebec was, furious, it really didn't matter. He had the Liberals were very strong in Quebec, and he had very strong ministers. So he had built up strength in French Canada, without a doubt.
He's peacemaking.
He has, without a doubt, peacemaking. Yeah. And Mackenzie King needs to be understood in those lights. He's not a great charismatic leader. He's more comfortable leading from the rear. He fades in comparison to Churchill and Roosevelt. But he doesn't tear us apart during the war, like we saw in the First World War. And I would say, when you look at him through the lens of Canadian-American relations, he is very good. He is very good. Thank you. Yeah. Yes?
My question, it's somewhat similar because I studied French-Canadian volunteers in the Second World War.
Right.
But I was wondering if you noticed any difference in the French-Canadian reaction to Americans joining the war, because you mentioned like there's surprise amongst Canada that America was neutral at the beginning.
Right. I'm looking forward to your research. No, not overly, except that, as I think I mentioned, that some French-Canadian politicians use the United States as an example, right? We don't really have to go into this war, right? I mean, we're not directly threatened at the moment. That doesn't really wash anywhere outside of English Canada. In terms of, we were always likely going into this war. I think the question is the extent of our commitment, and that's always up to us as Canadians. And it is astonishing, right? As I mentioned, the 1.1 million Canadians in uniform, 1.2 million in wartime industry, another 2 million. That's a lot of Canadians involved. And as you know from your own research, or will find, many French Canadians who serve as well. And so we do a better job, I suppose, in managing that unity in this war, although it can still be difficult at various times. Thanks. Yeah.
I want to say thank you for writing about Canadian history, because it's my firm belief if you don't write about it, or Canadians don't write about it, will be written out by somebody.
Yeah.
There's another thing maybe you should look at is all the industry. Like we only had, let's just say, 11.5 million people, but the amount of wartime material that was built in this country is phenomenal. And
Yeah.
every time you pick up an old bit of paper, oh, there's another factory over here doing
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah,
The
and-
British Army, like you said, they wrote on American design but Canadian built trucks.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, if we had sent no one overseas, if no one had joined the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, we would still, I think, be talking about the Second War 80 years later, because of how our wartime contributions on the industrial front were so significant, and how they really transform our country. We become a much more industrialized country, become a wealthier country. It helps that the world is in ruins in 1945. We lend $3 billion to Britain at the end of the war. I mean, imagine that. 10 years earlier, we're almost collapsing under the weight of the Depression. So the war transforms us in many ways. And I don't want to diminish what we do on the various battlefronts, but the industrial front deserves certainly to be raised as an important point of discussion, teaching, and perhaps of lesson making.
We did a contribution in espionage too, didn't we?
We did, yeah, less so. William Stevenson, Camp X, there's that side. We're involved in intelligence sharing. We're not generating a lot of that, but I wouldn't put that up at the same level as some of our other contributions. Yeah.
I'm curious about what lessons we can draw from your research in your book into the current global context. So there's eroding support for Canada to be sending funding to Ukraine right now.
Right.
Right. Trump's talking about coming to take Canada's water.
Right.
Right. So we see in post-war institutions that we've depended on start to erode, and certainly the confidence in them being undermined. So
Right.
how do we reconcile the lessons from your book to better understand the context we're in right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wouldn't want to stand up here and say if you read my book, you're going to figure out all the problems in the world. So, but you're right about take a couple of those examples. Ukraine, we have clearly put that to the back page, and there is lessening support in North America. And there's probably where an example of the election has just overpowered everything of what is happening. But if the war revealed anything, it was our support of, ironically, the Soviet Union in the fight against the Nazi forces, and how it's probably, to be terribly callous here, it's better for other people to die than Canadian soldiers if we can supply them with the weapons. I wouldn't want that to be the headline in the Globe and Mail tomorrow by Tim Cook, historian. But I think it is important to recognize, and as most people do, that if Ukraine falls, that that would be a significant blow, I think, to democracy around the world. Is it worth the cost? I think it is, but I have also seen others make the argument it's not, and we'll leave it to policymakers and politicians to sort that out. But that's a lesson there, I think, of what we did during the war, fighting on multiple fronts, wars of attrition. Decisive wars are very rare, and I think what we see in the Russian-Ukraine war is a war of attrition, and a war of attrition then requires men and weapons and perhaps technology as well. That is certainly a lesson from my book, that unless we support allies, in this case certainly they will fail. In other elements, I mean, questions of democracy and stuff are beyond me, but I think if I focus on the wheelhouse of this book, which is the Canadian-American alliance, I'll come back to this idea that, as it was mentioned here and others, that we need to remind the United States, especially with one candidate who doesn't believe in alliances or in making others pay more, that alliances come in many shapes and forms, and there is tremendous value to them. And you want to have a strong, stable country to your north. That's just part of it. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that we can be free riders. And I think you may have caught that at the end of my talk. I think one of the lessons from this war is that we realized we had to pay our way, and we had to pay our way on all fronts. And today we have to pay our way. And I would suggest probably for the last good number of years, we haven't fully paid our way in matters of defense and security. We may have done it in other areas, but I don't think we've been able to make the case that we've done it in other areas. And so I think now is the time that I've certainly seen opinion polls that most Canadians agree we need to put more money into defense and security. It's still up to us to decide where that goes and how it's positioned. And again, I'm not an expert on that, but it does seem to me, if you look at our history, we have continually sent our forces as part of NATO to Western Europe, but left the Arctic completely open and underdeveloped. And I think maybe where we stand best is now thinking again about the Northern Hemisphere and the Arctic and everything up that we can do there. Thanks. Any other questions or comments?
Thank goodness you're looking into it.
Well, thank you.
Thanks again.
Oh, thank you.
And as Tim has mentioned, the book is for sale down in our lobby, so please make sure you grab your copy, and I think Tim could even sign it.
I'd be happy to sign it.
Just to let you know that we have one more lecture this year for our military series on Thursday, November 21st. Someone you know, Jeff Hayes, will be speaking on a Canadian Army in the fall of 1944, a reappraisal of the soldiers' morale. So I think it's going to be really fascinating talk, and that's on November 21st at 7 o'clock. Also, if you like these lectures, we have a sign-up sheet at the front desk, and we can just keep you posted on any new lectures that are coming up. So, and thanks again, Tim, for coming, and hopefully we come.
Thank you.
You're here for your event.
That's great. Thank you.